Jeff Pulver, and today we're talking about when the Robocaller is an AI agent and the new rules of voice. And we're on the cutting edge of what's happening in the world of regulatory policy and technology. And I'm really grateful that Glenn and Sarah and Ron will be here today. When the first part of this, we'll be talking about the law, the rules, the regulations, and specifically what happens on the AI side. And then to prove that we're not AI ourselves, Ron and I will do a demo and talk and Ron will talk about how to in fact stop some of this from a technology perspective and some of the innovations that he's brought forth to demonstrate. If you have questions for the speakers, feel free to put them into the chat. We hopefully will have time toward the end to address specific questions. And with this, I'm going to hand over the microphone to Glenn.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate your having us today. Thrilled that I'm here with my colleague Sarah and Ron to talk about robocall rules. When Jeff sort of teed up this idea, he just asked me to sort of go through some of the robocall rules, some of the other proceedings that are happening at the FCC, and maybe some practical advice for the voice service provider community and the calling community. And then I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Sarah, who's a privacy expert, also is a litigator, to get into some of the details around AI calling and some of the risks that are out there for service providers and calling parties. So just to kick off, voice service providers, and when I use that term, it's generically whether it's wireless VoIP or the dwindling wireline community. These are heavily regulated services by both the Federal Communications Commission and the states, sometimes by the utility commissions, other times subject to many TCPAs. There's numerous rules and regulations that have been promulgated over the last few years to attempt to reduce and mitigate illegal robocalls. With that said, despite the fact that there are lots of rules already, there are also at least a half a dozen pending rulemakings at the FCC that will further evolve the landscape and change the regulatory framework. And I'm going to touch on those briefly as well. Despite all the efforts over the last 6 to 8 years by the federal government and the states to reduce the number of illegal robocalls, depending on which statistics you're looking at, there's still approximately 4 billion calls a month, and leading to substantial losses from scams and fraud, particularly targeting the elderly community in the United States. The result of all these robocalls is obviously folks are just not even willing to answer phone calls anymore from people that they haven't been able to verify that are in their phone book. The FCC is continually releasing guidance for service providers and consumers on how to stop these calls. There's 2 acts that have sort of teed up and described the platform and this ecosystem. The first is the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, the TCPA. The second is the TRACED Act, which was adopted a number of years ago, which specifically targets robocalling. And then the third, which is, I think, last or at least thought of, is the telemarketing sales rule, the TSR, which is enforced by the Federal Trade Commission. The TCPA sort of focuses on the difference between informational and marketing messages, depending on the type of messages that you're sending or the calls that you're making. They may require that you have express consent, whether that consent is written or not, depends on the type of the message. The telemarketing sales rule is what created the do not call list, and which the FCC requires for all calling that you now need to check the DNC to make sure folks are not on it before you can call them. The TRACED Act in particular has given the FCC's new tools to deter and enforce against robocallers. At its base, it created the requirement that the FCC implement and voice service providers implement what is known as the Stir-Shaken framework, which is an authentication framework that all calls must be authenticated and signed before they are delivered. That is to prevent call spoofing. The FCC has three levels of call authentication. One is an A attestation, another is a B, the other is a C. An A attestation basically means the voice service provider originating that call has both assigned the telephone number and has a relationship with that customer. The other levels of attestation, which are lower levels of attestation, the B level means you may have a relationship with the customer but didn't assign the phone number, or you may have assigned the phone number but don't have a relationship with the customer. And then the C attestation is, I'm not really sure who this person is, so I can't really attest to their identity or whether they're spoofing. And that is the lowest level of attestation. The FCC also requires all providers in the call chain. And when I talk about the call chain, those are originating service providers, those are intermediate service providers, gateway service providers, and in some respects, international service providers, as well as terminating service providers to make filings in what is known as the Robocall mitigation database. These are certifications and plans that the carriers are required to file that explain how they're going to deter and make sure that illegal calls don't get on their network. The FCC has been diligently reviewing RMDs, and in last year actually proposed to remove about 1,200 of those RMD filers because of problems with those filings and lack of compliance with FCC rules. There's currently a new FCC rulemaking that would further strengthen the certifications required with those RMD filings and would require the FCC to actually review all of those filings before they're uploaded. Right now, it is more on a sort of after the fact basis where the FCC is looking at those RMD filings. And anyone that is removed from the RMD because they have been facilitating illegal phone calls, carriers in the ecosystem are required to stop carrying those calls or actually to block calls from those companies. On February 8th, 2024, just real quickly, and Sarah's going to go into a bit more detail around this, the FCC issued a declaratory ruling that AI-generated voice calls will be treated as artificial and pre-recorded voice calls under the TCPA. This came as a result, you may recall, of the Joe Biden situation where there were folks that were imitating the voice of Joe Biden for nefarious reasons. I think it was in New Hampshire, and the FCC issued this declaratory ruling. There's a separate rulemaking regarding AI voice calls that the FCC has opened but has not resolved in the last year or two. There are also pending rulemakings that the FCC has for carriers and voice service providers regarding Know Your Customer. The FCC believes that by strengthening the Know Your Customer requirements, which are the information that carriers must collect before they can onboard new customers or before they can extend existing relationships with those customers, that by demanding more information and requiring more diligence, that may stem the call and stem the need for additional robocall violations. There's a new proceeding that the FCC is taking comments on, and they're actually due on August 10th, regarding upstream providers. An upstream provider is basically a reseller of your services. Again, the FCC has got an exhaustive list of information that they are proposing that voice service providers collect from anyone before they start making their services available for resale. The information goes well beyond name and address, includes collection of includes collection of ownership information, whether the company is located in foreign countries, includes requiring the voice service providers to actually review the robocall mitigation plans filed by those upstream providers and confirm that they comply with FCC rules. The FCC has got a separate rulemaking that has to do with caller identity. This would expand upon the Stir-Shaken framework, which focuses on the legitimacy of telephone numbers. That does not get to the legitimacy of who the caller is. There are now solutions in the marketplace, branded calling, that are using things like rich call data so that when you receive a call from Glenn Richards or Bank of America, that you can have some assurances that that's actually who is calling you. The FCC is proposing new requirements that would require you to pass that information through that this is Bank of America, but the industry is trying to figure out the best path forward. I mentioned briefly that there's also a new rulemaking which was just released last week, which would enhance the obligations for filing in the robocall mitigation database. Again, this would include review of those filings by FCC staff and include audit requirements, include additional filing fees, and have increasingly large fines for violating those RMD rules. There's also another FCC rulemaking regarding the resale of telephone numbers. The FCC is of the mind that it is that resellers of phone numbers may not be that the carriers are not enforcing their own rules around resale. The FCC has proposed to limit resale of phone numbers to one single reseller. That would prevent a reseller of a reseller to resell those telephone numbers. They're also looking for more accountability from resellers of telephone numbers. And that's a proposal that the FCC is got under consideration as well. Another issue that is sort of tied to the whole stir-shaken framework, the FCC is looking at transitioning to all IP networks. One of the failings that we have in the stir-shaken framework is stir-shaken only works when calls are IP end-to-end. As most folks that are kind of resident in the Pulver world know, there's still quite a bit of TDM remaining in the voice ecosystem. Every time there's a break in that, a signed call will not get delivered as signed. The FCC has been talking about a transition to all IP, I want to say for about 10 years now. There are proposals that would include requiring a transition to all IP by the end of 2028. But it's questionable at this point what the FCC is going to require the carriers to do or what they can do because of the cost to do that. And despite the fact that we've got already thousands of pages of decisions regarding robocalls, the Congress is actually considering new robocall legislation as well. Real quick now, I mentioned briefly that there are distinctions between the types of calls and how they need to be handled between informational and telemarketing calls. Callers and companies carrying those calls need to be concerned about what are known as dual marketing calls, where it may be informational and marketing at the same time. The FCC is taking the position that in those cases that those would be considered marketing calls and require higher levels of consent. There are also certain types of calls, whether it's debt collection, political calls, surveys, research calls from nonprofit, that those do not qualify as telemarketing, and they are subject to different rules, which I think Sarah is going to briefly get to as well. It's also important to the extent that you are in the calling ecosystem that you're aware of the FCC rules regarding revocation of consent. So you need to understand first how to capture and maintain the consent. But the FCC now has very broad rules on revoking consent. It can be more than just using a word like stop, that you have to be aware that any word that's like a stop would require you to immediately stop sending informational or telemarketing calls to those recipients. I think with that, we're sort of about 14 in. I want to hand off to Sarah so she can get into her presentation.
Great. I think, let's see. Yeah. All right. So my portion of this it's where we then kind of shift from compliance and we go into consequences. So what are the consequences of these things? So when we're dealing with calls are very inexpensive to do. There are pennies on the dollar, but every single one of those has a statutory component to it. And when we're looking at a robocall, any robocall that's an illegal robocall that violates the TCPA, it's going to come with a $500 to $1,500 amount to it. And that's not all of them. That is the amount for each call that is illegal. So if you're doing a campaign of say, 25, 2,500 calls, which is a typical marketing campaign, you're looking at amounts that are, 125 million. The other thing that keeps the plaintiff's bar coming is that these don't just have the one kicker. They don't have just the $500 to $1,500 per statutory violation pop. They have a treble damages kicker, which means if you're liable for 125 million off of a normal campaign that you're going to be looking at, when they affect that kicker, you're really looking at $375 million. So these are very easy cases for plaintiffs' lawyers to get very large amounts of money. And they're scary because it's very hard to defend these types of cases unless you really know what you're doing and unless you have the technology behind you that is properly tracking, the hours you're calling, the consents you're getting, and all of those things on the back end. And that's where a lot of companies, they don't have those things in place, or they're working with vendors who are rendering these marketing campaigns that are not properly tracking, and they don't properly back the language with indemnification and limitation of liability triggers on their vendor agreements to then put that third party on the hook for this third party liability that they may get stuck with, whether it's the FTC or it's these private plaintiffs. And I can tell you, while we talk about the FTC's regulations, FTC goes after the big guys. They're going after Dish Network. They're going after your large providers. What most of my clients have to be careful of, because I deal with the FTC very rarely, what I'm dealing with the most is private plaintiffs, right? And so you're looking at this slide. And so this one, you see the 500, per violation and 1,500 if it's willing or knowing. The second you don't have a plan in place and you are not able to track exactly how you are obtaining the consents for your campaign, this willful or knowing, where it's like, oh, well, they have to be able to prove that I knew I was violating this law. I knew that I was doing it. No, they don't. The floor for willful and knowing in this context is a tripwire. It's very easy for a plaintiff's lawyer to get over and take those statutory penalties from $500 to $1,500. Because really it's, did you actually take steps to try to be in compliance? Not did you actually know you were violating the law? You really have to be able to prove, to avoid this willful or knowing, that you took steps to audit what you were doing, to audit your logs, to audit all your consents, to audit and show that you were tracking your calls against the do not call list. You were taking steps to make sure you were calling within the right hours and that you were absolutely trying to comply, not that you willing or knowingly violated the law. So I think that language, we look at it and we think that it means something different. And I think it's very important for us to understand what it really means. And it really means you weren't taking those active steps to be in compliance. And you also can't say, well, I didn't know what the law was. If you're rolling out this technology, if you're rolling out these campaigns, you're using a third party to roll out these campaigns, the law expects you to know. You can't hide behind it. It's the same law where if you sign a contract, it doesn't matter if you didn't read or understand the contract. You're held to the standard of knowing. And that's the same way that this works. And that's where we get into this strict liability. Lack of intent doesn't matter, right? It's just, did you violate the law or did you not? Sorry, all right. So if you see here, and like I said, the FTC is going after the big guys. So the big settlements we've seen from the FTC or that we've seen are the Dish Network, and we've seen a lot of these other settlements. But where I see it the most isn't in the larger pieces of litigation. It's in these demand letters that are sent out to all these smaller companies. And because the risk of having to go to litigation and fight these things and the amount of damages is so great, a lot of times they're just looking for, a few $1,000s for one person that they know rather than actually try to certify a class or do a mass arbitration. But in order to leverage a hefty settlement prior to ever having to do any legwork in litigation, they send these demand letters. And these demand letters are scary enough that if we do see that there's a violation in our systems, through the audit that we'll start to run, early settlement makes a lot of sense. And these plaintiffs' councils knows that. And so these things have kind of increased over the years. And I think that's another thing that's really interesting about this line of cases is that in 2020, we got the Facebook decision where it was basically saying, you know, for it to qualify as, it has to be by an auto dialer. It has to have this specific piece of technology. And if it doesn't, it's not, certain things aren't going to qualify, right? What happened was rather than claims go down, claims skyrocketed. We've seen more claims ever since this, what should have been this big decision to stop a bunch of stuff and to temper a bunch of cases down. It increased. And we've never seen an increase or an influx of cases like we've seen in the past couple of years. So you have to think, why is this happening? Why, when we're getting decisions that should be good and should temper down the number of claims and the number of cases being filed, is it going up? And there's two reasons why this is happening. Plaintiffs' lawyers are getting more creative. And not only are they going under federal statutes, now they're hooking their claims under state statutes. And California is going to be the most critical one because it has the SIPA law, which is the California Invasion of Privacy Act, SIPA, CIPA. And these are pen register and these are consent cases that are being filed by, the thousands, and demand letters being sent by the thousands. But we have other state statutes in Pennsylvania and Florida and a number of other states that have similar, and we're seeing those types of claims being tacked on. We're also seeing them get creative and bring in other types of stuff. The second thing that we're seeing is AI. And we'll go into that. That's going to hit more of the back end of this presentation where we go in kind of the AI agents on the robocalls. But AI has been another thing because they've said that these AI voices, this conversational AI agent is regulated exactly like a robocall. What's happened with not only the AI agents being able to speak, as part of the call, but also what's happening is the calls are being recorded and transcribed. So now we're going from, it's not just a robocall issue about whether the robocall is allowed in the first place, but now if the call is being recorded, we're now hitting on a consent issue. Do we have the consent for the call do you need prior express consent, or do you need, if it's advertising, prior express written consent? And if it's being recorded, are you in a one-party consent state or are you in a two-party consent state where we have to track that type of consent? So there are four kind of fact patterns that we kind of see the most in these types of cases. Can you go back one? And the first is in the consent gaps. And this is where your technology vendor, it really matters that you're working with a good one and you understand how they're actually tracking the consent and how the consent is actually registered. And in here, we normally register this at either the beginning of a relationship or at the beginning of the call. So you are going to start seeing, and you might have already started to see it whenever you do get a call. It used to just be, we're recording this call for quality assurance purposes. Well, now it's going to become a laundry list of all of the things that they're going to have to say. We're doing this for quality assurance purposes. We may use this call to train our people. This call is, being recorded and transcribed. And you're also not talking to a real person. This is AI generated technology. You're going to start seeing these things. And that's because of the consent that's going to be required. And we are dealing also with a new potential FTC regulations that may go into effect, and they're going to require those types of things. So it's already kind of through the comment period. We're now just kind of waiting to see what the commission's actually going to do with it. So a lot of this is in the consent, and just not having, being able to track the types of consent that it needs. Is it expressed consent, expressed written consent? What do you really need? So consent gap is one of the first things that we see on these types of calls. The next that we see the most is missed or mishandled opt-outs. Now, for this one, when we are listening to somebody on the phone, it's kind of difficult. It's not like when we're dealing with a text message and they text stop or they text opt-out or things like that. This is a different one where they are screaming into the phone. They're saying things into the phone. And one of the biggest cases we have is from a law firm And this is in kind of the robocall piece, and we'll kind of gloss over it. Thanks, I'm telling you about it now. But in that case, what happened was there was a law firm. They were soliciting clients for a class action they had. So they're basically calling and basically being like, "Hey, have you ever been harmed by this type of device? Yes or no, and are you interested in?" The people being called are like, "No, stop, no, no, no," and they were continuing to say, "No, no, no, like leave me alone." The call kept going, generated by an AI agent, and it keeps going. And so this law firm got sued because it wasn't properly registering that these no's that these people were saying into the robocall, into the technology, were opting them out. So not only are they not stopping the call as soon as they opt out, they're also not putting them on a do not call list, their internal list to not call them again. So these people are getting called again after they've already basically opted out. And so we see that a lot when with this type of technology. And is the technology drawn? Is the algorithm done in the right way? Where when somebody communicates in whatever language that this is being done, that they are opting out, that they do not want called, that they aren't having to say certain words. They don't have to say special words. They don't have to say, opt me out of this. They just have to be expressive enough to indicate to a reasonable person that they were trying to opt out. The technology has to be sophisticated enough to recognize that voice is communicating that as an opt out. So you really have to kind of triage the language that you're going to use in the model to be able to understand when somebody is receiving a robocall that they want completely opted out of this, to be able to then make that opt out and then have that 10 days to take them off, communicate to vendors that they need to be taken off in order to comply with the law. Because essentially what we're looking at right now with your robocall campaigns that are going in right now, there's a 4-year statute of limitations. So right now, claims that we're seeing now are from 2022 forward. And right now, the problems that we're having, you're going to see those all the way, in 2030. So that's kind of where we're seeing things. The technology keeps changing and we're seeing it do better, but it's changed so much, especially with AI, that the problems that we're facing in our 2022 cases aren't AI, cases, but the cases that we're going to see going forward, they are going to be the AI robocall cases. All right, the third type of robocall issues are the quiet hours. And the quiet hour issue is you can't call somebody in a robocall, for certain purposes between the hours of 8 and 9, so 8 a.m. and 9 p.m. And this is by time zone. And a lot of technology is triggered toward the actual zip code of the phone number. So it's usually, or the area code, sorry, not zip code, area code of the phone number. So if I have a Columbus, Ohio zip code, I'm in the Eastern time zone, it's going to register me for the Eastern time zone. But what if I'm not in the Eastern time zone at the time? I'm in the Pacific time zone. So if I get a call at 7 p.m., if I get a call at, a certain time, it's going to trigger into that because I wasn't in that time zone. And so a lot of the products struggle with, are we going to be using area code technology and running our campaigns off area code technology? Are we going to be running it off IP technology where we're kind of geo-sourcing the location of the person before we're trying to send the calls? So technology has had to kind of, keep up with this quiet hour call too. You got to remember this legislation came at a time when people were making, calls kind of more by hand. They're being done by people. And then we had the technology that's now it's doing it by these auto generators. And when the companies shut off, these auto-generated type of calls. Normally you'll run a campaign to run in certain continents at certain periods of time so that, you try to stay away from those hours. But I mean, I got a class action last week and it's a quiet hours case. And somebody in California received a advertising text message that they didn't subscribe to at 7:53 or yeah, it was after 9 and we're in their time zone. So it was only a few minutes past, but it was based on where they were. So another one that we see a lot is the quiet hours. And then they send these kind of just mass demand, that they're going to every single person that received text messages and they'll sue you in a class action. And then in discovery, what they do is they send, you the list of, where, what all numbers did you send this campaign? And then they back in their plaintiffs. They'll start with one plaintiff, use you to find the rest of the class for them based on your records and your call sheets. And that's how they get into the millions, with millions of people joining these class actions. I think the biggest one that I've dealt with is probably about 68,000, but they get pretty dicey and spicy. Um, the others, this really doesn't, for us, I mean, we know our robocalls, we are kind of working under this type of technology. And then really where it comes into impact here is when you're using AI, you're already triggering into the robocall theories of liability. So how do we, kind of, I guess, go into, what are the things that to do to kind of stop this? And the way that I go to stopping this is having, I mean, the best way to do this to start is consent. And that is, the best way to be what you want to do when I'm defending these and I get one of these demand letters or I get a cease and desist letter is I go to my client and I'm like, I want to see all of your logs of how you capture consents. I want to see how it's done and I want to see the playbook because normally when you're building out something like this, everything is done in kind of screenshots of the technology, right? So I'll either get a beta version of what they're going to do and they send it to my phone, so I'll either play it on my phone or I'll play it on the website, however it's being done that they're capturing consent. The other way that I'll do it is kind of through a marketing block where I will see they will do screen grabs of how they're building out the technology and how the consents are running, show me how they obtained the consent, and then they show me how it's captured in the actual audit log so that we can track how consent is actually being captured. And you're a good technology provider, that's what they're able to do the best for you. And they're able to explain how this is actually working and show you either through that beta test so you can see it yourself, or you can see it in kind of the marketing materials of how they're actually building out the consent. But that's the first place that I go when I have to defend this. And a lot of times I am working with a technology company that built the tech or built the campaign, sometimes rather than my client. So the other one is you got to handle the opt-outs. You've got to be able to have the technology that's going to be able to listen for the words. I don't want to receive your calls anymore, rather than tie the technology to specific words like help or opt out, no, things like that, or do not disturb. You have to build the technology to receive every type of opt out that there might be. The other one is respecting the clock and making sure that you're tying your campaigns and you're tying the numbers and the delivery of these calls to specific time zones and being able to identify where the people are actually sitting. Our technology's gotten a lot better of identifying exactly where someone's, specific geographic location is. That's data that we're able to collect with proper notices and proper consents to get that information and use that information. So when we're running those campaigns, if we have that, we should be using that technology to ensure that we are marketing and doing targeted marketing during the hours when we're allowed to do them. But on the flip side of that is another consent issue. So under privacy laws, in most states, in order to get specific geolocation data, which is considered sensitive information, you have to get prior consent to even get that type of information. So there's numerous ways to get consent, but you've got to make sure you get it the right way. And one way that you're not allowed to obtain consent is you can't bundle a TCPA consent. I see this a lot of times, and it's where where you're getting the consent and it's like, by staying on this call, you agree that we can do A, B, C, D, E. Well, a lot of consent, whenever you're agreeing to that somebody can use your phone number to text or call you or things like that, you can't bundle that consent with anything else. It has to be standalone. So you can't say, I agree to the terms of your privacy policy and your terms and conditions, and also you can send me text messages, and also you can do all of these things. They have to do a standalone in order for that consent to be real and viable. The other thing, I guess, is auditing your vendors, right? I mean, usually you're not working on this alone. You're working with a tech vendor who's rolling out your campaign, rolling out this technology. Make sure that you are dealing with a good vendor, that you understand the technology, and that they can talk to you about the technology. And they can also explain the terms in their contract, or you can understand the terms in yours if you want them to sign onto your paper. And if they won't consent to terms of your paper, be ready to walk, especially when it comes to indemnification and limitation of liability. I'll tell you what, if I work with a vendor and they give me a crappy contract, I don't say, oh, this is great. I want to work with this vendor. This contract is only 3 pages. Let's go. This is easy. I don't want to work with that vendor because I know that that vendor doesn't have proper legal. And if they don't have proper legal, they probably don't have a lot of other proper things that I want to work with. So I want to work with a company that has strong contracts, strong language, and we're having a discussion about what these terms actually look like. So we're understanding where this liability is and what this actually means for terms of where they need to be compliant and make sure that they're doing the right thing. Because if they don't understand what they're legally supposed to do or trying to punt to me, that's not a vendor I want to be working with at the end of the day. So audit your vendors, audit your contracts, understand where liability runs, and make sure that when you tell a vendor to knock somebody off a do not call list, they knock them off. And if they don't knock them off, the liability has to go to them. You have downstream, downflow indemnity to them if they don't get someone off a do not call list. And you've got to make sure that you have a proper procedure in place for the do not call list. It's the same thing when you have a data breach. If you work with a vendor and they cause a data breach, are they going to be responsible for it? Or is the liability going to sit with you? Because under law, it sits with you. Did you take it down to the vendor through proper flow downs? If you don't, you're going to be stuck with it and you're not going to be able to recover from them. A lot of vendors try to get around downflow indemnification by capping it or taking it out or saying it can't be there. And this is our standard contract and we don't negotiate. Well, then I don't work with you. We're not going to work with you. There are plenty of other technology vendors that will negotiate in good faith and understand that if they screw up, they need to be on the hook for it. It's going to work the same way when you're doing a do not call issue and you need to remove somebody for a do not call list. You need to make sure in your agreement with them, there's a proper notification process about who you're going to notify and within how many days they are going to take that off. So just be very thoughtful in what you're actually negotiating to make sure you have those proper provisions. I get asked to review contracts all the time without the client giving me much background about what the services they are actually providing. And that's a big problem because if I don't know what services they're supposed to be providing, I can't make sure that I am making sure that I'm putting in those data breach or those do not call, and I'm building in the proper notification removal mechanisms to make sure people are properly opted out. All right, so just work closely with your vendors and your lawyers to make sure you're negotiating the proper contracts. So let's get into part two. And again, we've dived into this a little bit already, where the robocaller is the AI agent and what this means. But what it has said is that an AI voice, while it's an artificial voice, it's going to be held under the exact same laws and the exact same framework as normal robocalls do. It's going to be governed by the TCPA. And what's also happening is because these are calls that are usually being recorded now, we are now facing not only these robocalls, the TCPA and the FTC, we're also having consent laws, and it's driving into additional state litigation. So, what also has happened with this is, well, I guess where we're headed. I'm not gonna. I won't even go into where we're headed because we'll just dive in. So the three consequences of an AI voice. So the first thing, and Glenn kind of talked about this, and this is the declaratory ruling where cloned voices, including fully conversational interactive agents, rather than static voices, are an artificial voice. So we're kind of gone with the days. Remember, I told you the technology is always changing. Well, we're not. We were in that the landscape of, you know, this is your call, and I'm going to hand you off to a real person. Well, now it sounds like you're handed off to a real person, but you're not actually being handed off to a real person. It's still just an AI agent doing all of that. And because of that, all of the same rules and conditions apply. So we still have the consent tier where prior express consent for any AI voice call to a wireless number and prior express written consent for any telemarketing call still applies. So they think that these aren't, depending on how they're done, they're like, well, it's not a robocall. I'm not using this type of technology. But because you're using an AI voice, that consent goes back in. There is a circuit split though, and this is where we're seeing some ability for us to take apart some of the class actions. And I think this kind of discourse will continue to happen. And that is, we have a circuit split where the Fifth Circuit held that they don't need prior written consent. They just need prior express consent. So they didn't need that written piece. You only needed the prior express consent, meaning that if someone sues in a nationwide class action, so let's say they cite this thing in California and they cite the entire nation in it of people who receive these robocalls. what happens in a case like this is we try to basically, if we say that there was prior consent, but just not prior written consent, we're going to try to opt to try to get the class to exclude every single person that's in the states of Texas, LA, and Mississippi, which is governed by the Fifth Circuit, who has held that this prior consent is enough, right? So we're going to try to mitigate and take out some of those class numbers by arguing this split in the circuit law. Again, there are a number of cases pending in other circuits. I think we're going to continue to see these split, but this is just a defense mechanism that we try to use to, take out some of the sting of a class action to the extent we can. Again, we're going to see more of these, but my philosophy on something like this, you don't want to be in the class action anyway, right? You want to defeat the whole class, not just part of the circuits. So what I would do, just always comply to the top tier of compliance, which is usually California, and that's always going to be prior express written consent. The other consequence of using an AI agent, and that is going to be your artificial voice disclosures that are going to be required. And that is at the outset of the call, you have to identify the entity that's calling, a callback number, an automated interactive opt-out mechanism on all telephone marketing calls. You also are not going to have an established business relationship exemption. That used to be a big thing. If you had a business relationship with a company within 18 months or you bought a product within 3 months, you could argue that there was an existing business relationship and you could get out of liability. That's not really a thing for this type of product, for this type of technology. So you're not going to be able to do that. So those are the kind of the three consequences that we have. The next is, and Glenn kind of talked about this one, and this was the deep fake. This is the Biden AI agent bot that was, calling people in New Hampshire and saying, do not vote in the primary election. The issue is the downflow liability that Glenn didn't get into. And that is, look how many different violations and fines were issued in that. So the caller itself got a forfeiture sanction from the FCC for $6 million. The carrier then got its own $1 million consent decree requirement from the FCC for applying an improper A-level stir, shake, and attestation to the traffic. Then the person who consulted the political campaign and said, yeah, sure, you can do this. This is a great idea. They got brought up on criminal charges for this. And then for VSBs, Glenn did a great job at talking about the know your customer due diligence that's required on customers originating AI generated traffic. The next part of this is the lawsuits, and we've already kind of seen the first one start to hit, because again, as soon as new technology hits, the plaintiff's bar is the first to hit the ground running with, can we make a claim out of this? How can we apply new technology to old laws? How can we get these statutory penalties to hit and those treble damages? We saw the first one, and that was the Lamb versus Mortgage One funding case that was filed in February of this year. And that was when an AI agent cold called customers that was pitching cash out refinancing and home improvement loans. And then it transferred agents to a live sales agent. A couple of things that the plaintiff's bar did with this one that it does really well, and that is it really pleaded AI, synthetic speech. So it really pleaded, that it learned how to plead AI identity, essentially. And that means that they couldn't prove it was AI. It's not a strategy. The second is that the class definition doesn't distinguish between calls that the company placed directly and calls placed by its vendors and lead generators. And that's kind of what happened with the Dish Network vicarious liability, issue. The next is litigation theories and discovery in AI agents. And the first is the mid-call opt-out failure is independently actionable. And what that means is they're not honoring these stops and the no's. And we already went into it with the law firm case. That's kind of the biggest thing is you're not opting these people out. You're not properly getting off the do not call list. And that's kind of the first thing. The next is the claim stacking. So when there is one violation, there's usually multiples. So not only are you going to probably have a consent issue, but you're likely to see also a violation of the do not call, that you're calling somebody on a do not call list. Somebody opted out and you did it anyway, or you called them outside of their hours. And then you'll see kind of these other state many TCPA state claims. And so now not only you're hitting under one federal statute, you're hitting under a federal statute more than one time. So you're pinging that $500 or $1,500 more than once as you stack. You're also hitting these state law claims, making these things very expensive. And the reason you aren't seeing cases, because what did I say? I said, if you do a normal campaign at 125 million for a violation and you treble it to 325, why aren't you actually seeing cases for that? The reason you're not is they're settling because it's too freaking scary to go into court on the hook for potentially $400 million and also paying attorneys on that. So these things, they settle. So what do we do to kind of avoid these issues? The first is own the consent record. Again, this is working with your deployment team. The next is build the disclosures into the agent itself. Identify at the outset of the call, the entity, the callback number, and an interactive opt-out mechanism. Build your program recognition, a revocation recognition to understand what people are saying and what any type of version of words can mean to revoke. Scrub every campaign against the national DNC, internal DNC list, pass those down to your vendors and make sure your vendors have a contractual obligation to remove. And if they don't, that they're on the hook through an indemnification clause to reimburse you or take over defense if they're the one that get you in trouble. Run vendor diligence on the AI platform, which we've discussed, and then make sure you're preserving that audit trail. Again, this is working with your technology vendors to make sure they're tracking those conversation and audit logs and those consent requirements. So thank you guys so much for your time. I'll pass this back over to Jeff.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a lot. Thank you, Glenn. And I'm gonna hand this over to Ron in 1 second. I just want to just clarify one question I had, Sarah, before you go, because I was just taking notes while you were talking. I understand the robocalling. I appreciate all the law on that. Question, and Glenn, maybe stop sharing the screen so Ron could queue up his stuff. If someone's deploying voice AI agents or building them, is it in the U.S.? If they have any client of any of the new voice AI companies, are you saying that all the TCPA rules apply to anyone deploying voice AI agents today?
Without knowing exactly the technology they're doing, no, but I think it's a fair assumption that they should be compliant because to me it seems like the law is trying to treat them that
Okay.
way. Yeah.
Okay. I'll talk to you offline about that because that raised a big red flag for, I don't know, 42 companies I've spoken to in the last 3 months. Thank you so
Well,
much.
I mean,
Ron?
especially with with actually the two-party consent laws, especially if these calls are recording and transcribing the information. If they're recording and transcribing, you're falling into some of the requirements of TCPA anyway, and you're falling under these different state laws. So for me, when I'm working with my clients from a regulatory side, I'm going to try to make sure that we're building out as much as we can. But again, I look at the technology about what's actually happening before I actually tell them which laws are specifically going to apply to them before we actually do that. But without knowing the exact technology, but I usually try to build to full compliance on any law.
Thank you. All right. And thanks for the clarity. Ron, over to you. And please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, nice to meet you all. I'm Ron Kerbs. I'm the founder and CEO of Kidas. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the technology side behind AI voice and how to detect them. But before we do that, if you can raise your hand, if you think you're a good driver, please raise your hand. If you have your camera on. I know that about 80% of the people think that they're better drivers than most drivers, which statistically it's impossible. And in AI, it's almost the same. Most people think that if an AI agent, if an AI generated voice call them, they will definitely know that it's an AI agent, it's an AI generated voice. But the reality shows us that a lot of people cannot distinguish between AI generated voice and a real voice. So I asked Jenna from our marketing to test it out with you guys. So what we're going to do is I'm going to play 2 short clips, audio clips. One of them is an actual speech by Jenna from our marketing team, and the other one is AI generated. And I'll let you decide which one is the real one and which one is AI generated. Let's start with this one.
There's nothing better than a cup of coffee in the morning.
Were you able to hear it? Let's
Yes.
do it again.
There's nothing better than a cup of coffee in the morning.
Okay, now let's try the other one.
There's nothing better than a glass of vodka in the morning. There's nothing better than a glass of vodka in the morning.
Okay, so I told you that one of them is AI generated. Which one do you think is AI generated? Please write it in the chat. It's really hard to distinguish between AI generated and a real one. Please write in the chat if you think you can distinguish which one is the real one. And just take into account that the AI generated one was created from a sample of about 5 seconds of her real voice. Each one of us, including myself now, because it's going to be on YouTube, has about 5 minutes that are publicly available and can use by scammers to recreate your voice. And that's exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about AI generated voice. So humans can no longer tell because AI generated voice are super realistic. It's not the robotic calls that we used to get, I don't know, 10 years ago. And as Sarah talked about before, they are conversational. You can respond sometimes. Sometimes you say no, 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 and they don't respond. But sometimes if they are built properly and scammers know the job, they can respond. And the latency is so small that you cannot distinguish between a real person and an AI generated agent. And the most important thing that make a lot of people fall for those AI generated scams is that attackers can clone your voice, as I just showed you. Family members, executives, your boss, public figures like Joe Biden in 2024, all of that is pretty easy to make using the Frontier Labs. You only need a few seconds of the voice. So why AI-generated scams are surging? It's easy to see. It's near zero marginal cost. You don't need call centers. You don't need to train your people. You don't need to hire people with the right accent. You don't need them to be operating in the right time zone. They can work 24/7. They can run millions of simultaneous calls across every language or in every time zone. And they can personalize the message specifically for you. So they can scrape social media, and they can get access to databases and tailor the scam specifically for you using the voice of your mom or maybe your boss or the CFO of the company. All of that is possible with the AI scams. And that's why we see a lot of people falling for those scams and losing billions of dollars. Unfortunately, we talked about what the FCC is telling voice providers to do, and they're telling them to maintain caller ID, and they're telling them to register in the robocall mitigation database. All of those things, when we're talking about AI scams, are not relevant anymore. So scammers can get clean caller ID. They just hack someone who has a clean caller ID. A lot of those PBX boxes are pretty much open. Or they can just purchase a legitimate VoIP user using a shell company. And they use normal calling patterns. So they're not just calling, blasting thousands of people at the same moment. They're using it as a person would use it. And so a system is finding it very hard to distinguish between human patterns and AI patterns because the AI patterns are basically mimicking the human pattern. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to try to scam Jeff. So what I'm going to do is live in this call, I'm going to run my phone. I'm going to call Jeff with a, first of all, traditional robocall scam, the one that we know from like 10 years ago and some scammers are still using. And the other one, I'm just going to sound snow day emergency. That's AI-generated message that a school principal or maybe you get from your bank. It's a legitimate message, but it still sounds like a person. So let's try it out, and let's see if we can scam Jeff.
Hello?
Department of the Social Security Administration.
The reason you have received this phone call from our department is to inform you that there's legal enforcement actions filed on your social security number for fraudulent activities. So, when you get this message, kindly call back at the earliest possible on our number before we begin with the legal proceedings, that is 985-602-2086. Thank you.
That was the first call. Now let's try another call. Let's try a call that is basically an announcement from a school principal.
Hello?
Good morning, families. This is Principal Miller. Due to expected heavy snowfall and hazardous road conditions, all district schools will be closed today. Please stay safe and warm, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
So the first call, most people would know that it's, not a machine. It's a robot. It's not a person. And in the other call, it sounds recorded. You're not really sure what is it all about. So one of the things that we want to test is what can we do with those things. So as I said before, just knowing that it's an AI generated doesn't show you anything. What does it mean? It could be an AI generated call from a legitimate business, a bank, or it could be an AI generated scam from a scammer. So what we do is we combine acoustic analysis. So we look at the natural speech patterns and we can detect AI signatures. And the AI signatures basically show you if the call is AI generated or if the call is a real person calling you. And by combining those acoustic analysis features, you can understand if the call is AI generated or a person. But as I said before, if we just do that, that's not enough. Why is it not enough? Because legitimate calls could be AI generated, as we just saw before. And AI generated calls are also generated by scammers. So what do you do in those cases? It's pretty hard to distinguish those cases. So what we should do is basically, and that's what we're doing, is we're combining the acoustic analysis and the sign that tells us that's an AI generated scam and that's not a real person with the CDR, with the call detail record, and things like where is the call originating from? What is the duration? What is the distribution? All of those information. And once you combine this information, as I told you, AI is trying to mimic humans' behavior. As we combine this information with the acoustic information, it can tell us if it's an AI generated. It can also tell us other features like, is it pre-recorded? If it could be a person, but it could be pre-recorded person. Based on that, we can create a unified threat matrix. And using the threat matrix, we can understand in real time, telling voice providers in real time if we're dealing with a scam or if we're dealing with a legitimate person calling you or a campaign even. So when we're talking about the mechanics, we can see that you have privacy that is really important, and Sarah talked about it. You cannot record the conversation, you cannot store it on a disk, and because you want to protect the user confidentiality, and you don't want to be wiretapping. So we cannot analyze the content of the conversation, but what we can do is analyze the mathematical wave and the features of the conversation without listening to the content, just the content or the spoken words. We're just analyzing the wavelengths and the AI signatures, and it has to have like strict compliance. So we have to follow all of the rules and regulations that we talked about, to understand what are we dealing with. So that's really important. So with that, I would be happy to move it to Q&A, and we can take it from there.
Wonderful. Thank you. There was a question. If you could just put the questions in the chat, that'd be easier. We're about to run over the 1 hour mark, so we'll take questions for a couple of minutes before we run down. Yeah, everyone's going to leave at 2 o'clock. Ron, first of all, thank you for this. I'm just curious, the demonstration that you did, how that was integrated into the fabric of FWD, right?
It was integrated into FWD, and I forgot to show you what was the result. So Jeff, you answered on one end, and you can see the call base. So you can see that was the call, and you can see that we're talking about. You're going to see Jeff's name. So I called Jeff, and on the other side it was me, and you can see that our algorithm detected that in one side it was human, which was Jeff, and the other side was machine. So basically, it was able to distinguish in both cases if we're talking with a human being or if we're talking with a machine. So on my end, I can see that, okay, I'm talking with an AI-generated voice, and it was all done in real time on the FWD system to show you that in real time.
And by the way, you're also looking at that was a VCon. If you're curious, you heard about virtualized conversations, the file structure that you were seeing was a VCon, virtualized conversation. Mitchell, if you could put the question into the, you raised your hand, but just put your question into the chat, that'd be easy. Oh, look, I would like to, Ron, thank you for the demonstration. That was wonderful. And if people want more information about where you're building, that your website is.
Our website is getkeyless.com, and I'll put it in the chat.
I don't know how I got muted. Glenn and Sarah, thank you so much for being part of this today. I think based on the content alone, I think we have to do this again, maybe with more demos. And I think the impact of, in the US anyway, of TCPA rules and regulations, and the need to understand consent with purpose, to understand one-party consent, two-party consent, by the people developing these AI agents, I think is really important. I think there's a lot of knowledge transfer. So we have the opportunity to defend the networks. With Ron has the ability to detect the robocalling and the bad actors, if you will. And at the same time, we have a need to educate people building the platforms on how they could also be compliant. So it sounds like there's a duality, or maybe it's multiple challenges here and opportunities. Let me, if I could, I'm going to invite Glenn and Sarah to join us for the wrap up. Any comments based on Glenn and Sarah, what you saw, what Ron demonstrated? Any feedback to share, if you like?
No, I mean, it's fascinating technology. I think that if you look at the new FCC proceeding on Know Your Upstream Provider, the FCC is actually encouraging voice service providers to adopt analytics. I think it doesn't go into sort of the level of detail. I think Ron has recognized some of the pitfalls of certain analytics and sort of when something may or may not be a call recording. And I think we're starting to see lawsuits as well that are addressing this issue, particularly in California. So, you need to be thoughtful as you're building these tools to, recognize where the risks are, how to share the risks, and how to minimize those risks. And thank you for having us, Sarah.
Yeah, I guess, to the question that Jeff asked, does this technology governed by this law? And it really is. Really understand what your technology is doing. Is it going to a landline? Is it going to a web? Is it going to a wireless caller? Like, where is it going to go? And really work with your counsel and work with your technology provider to understand what your technology is doing, so that we can build out the proper contracts and we can provide, really specifically what your legal obligations are. The more you know what you're doing, what you're trying to do with your campaigns, the better we're able to then figure out what your actual regulatory and compliance requirements are, so that we can make sure that we're building those out from the get-go, rather than having to defend something later in litigation.
Well, on that note, I want to say thank you to everyone who's tuned us in, and Glenn and Sarah, thank you so much. Ron, thank you. We'll do another follow-up. We'll do something in August or going into September. And this is definitely something I will be covering at Voice and Conversations on the Net in October. I'm so fascinated now about that, the whole idea of incumbents or people looking to the old regulations to stop new innovation, something which we lived through first in 1996, and I think it's going to continue to grow. Thank you all for joining us online. Lauren, thanks for monitoring this and running this, and really, I hope you all have a great summer, and we'll be back soon, and really grateful to all of you for joining us today. And this will be up on YouTube, and everyone who's in the session, you'll be getting an email later today with the link. Thank you all. Thanks for joining today.
Bye-bye.